They laughed at the engineers. Not to their faces, of course. No one was foolish enough to do that in front of a man who handled explosives for a living. But in the cafes behind the lines, in the foxholes at night, infantrymen would joke that the engineers were the fellows with shovels and tape measures, the ones who built bridges and filled potholes, while everyone else did the real fighting. They didn't say that on the front line in 1944. Not on that river. Not once they watched a bridge vanish before dawn. It began with a map. Spread across a rough wooden table under a sagging tent roof, the paper was stained with mud, coffee rings, and the fingerprints of a dozen anxious officers. A thin blue line cut across it from edge to edge. A river, nameless here, but all too real to the men who'd seen it. On the far bank, a thick black rectangle marked the objective. A German-held bridge, stone and steel, strong enough to carry tanks. Too strong to ignore. If that bridge stood, the enemy could retreat in good order, reinforce another line, make the Allies bleed for every mile. If it fell, the withdrawal would turn into chaos. Trucks, guns, and men would jam the roads, trapped on the wrong side of the water. It was a simple equation, but in war, the simplest problems demanded the most complicated courage. Around the table, the officers argued. Artillery barrages, airstrikes, direct assaults. Every option meant time, casualties, uncertainty. Then someone quietly suggested the one group nobody thought of first. Give it to the engineers. Across the field, in a patch of churned earth and scattered equipment, the men of the engineer battalion were busy doing what they always did, making the impossible merely difficult. Bulldozers growled as they carved new tracks through the mud. A squad hammered pickets into the ground, stringing barbed wire where a defensive line would soon exist. Nearby, a team hunched over a Bailey bridge panel, tightening bolts with practiced swings. To a passing infantryman, it didn't look like heroism. It looked like work. But the engineers knew better. They had a saying, "The line doesn't move until we do." One of them, Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney, had been building things his whole life. Before the war, he'd worked on road crews in Ohio, laying concrete under the summer sun. When the draft came, the Army looked at his hands, calloused and scarred, and knew exactly where to send him. He didn't complain. "A bridge is a bridge," he'd told his wife in his last letter home. "Doesn't matter if it's over a creek or a war." That afternoon, a jeep pulled up in a spray of mud. A lieutenant jumped out, clutching a folder thick with orders. "Delaney, battalion wants you at command post. They've got a special job." Delaney wiped his hands on his trousers and followed, boots squelching in the wet ground. He'd heard that phrase before. Special job usually meant something no one else wanted to touch. Inside the tent, the air smelled of wet canvas, tobacco, and nervous sweat. The map lay open on the table, that blue river cutting the world in half. The bridge was circled in red pencil, heavy and dark. "This is our problem," the colonel said, tapping the circle. "German held, wired for demolition, covered by machine guns and anti-tank guns. We need it gone, but we need it gone on our terms." Delaney stepped closer, eyes narrowing. He could see the contour lines, the bends in the river, the roads feeding into either side. It was like looking at a blueprint drawn by someone who'd never laid a brick but knew exactly where every load-bearing wall should be. "You want it dropped, sir?" he asked. "I want it vanished," the colonel replied. "No crossing, no repair, no quick fix. And I want it to happen before those bastards can use it to move out. We don't have days. We have one night." Delaney studied the map in silence. The infantry officers traded impatient glances. To them, this was just another blow to weaken the enemy. To Delaney, it was a question of angles, charges, supports, the way stone and steel would behave when the earth shook beneath them. "We'll need to get under it," he said finally. "On the piers. They've probably wired the obvious places already. If we hit it from below with shaped charges on the main supports, we can make it drop in its own footprint. River will take the rest. Can you do it? He didn't answer right away. In his mind, he could already hear the night, the slap of water against stone, the crack of German rifles, the dull thump of boots on planks above his head. He could feel the sweat on his fingers as he wired the charges in the dark, counting by touch, not sight. "Yes, sir," he said at last. "If you can get us close." That was the bargain, always. The infantry and armor made the road. The engineers made it matter. The plan took shape in careful, measured strokes. An infantry company would stage a feint on a nearby ford, drawing German attention and artillery away from the bridge. At the same time, under cover of darkness, a small engineer detachment would move along the riverbank, hauling explosives in sandbag-wrapped crates. A boat team would ferry them across to the piers, where Delaney and his men would climb out onto the cold stone and start their work. "Minimal noise," the colonel stressed. "No heroics. If they spot you, it's over." Delaney nodded. He'd heard that before, too. In his experience, no heroics meant there would be plenty of them, but the kind no one wrote songs about. That evening, as the sky turned the color of old iron, the men assigned to the mission gathered by the river. Each carried more than equipment. They carried the knowledge that if they failed, a lot of other men would die trying to do by daylight what they were attempting by night. One of the younger engineers, Private Lewis, stared at the dark water and tried to steady his breathing. "You ever done something like this before, Sarge?" he asked. Delaney thought about the bridges he'd seen, some intact, some twisted heaps of rubble, some half-dropped by frightened enemy engineers who'd hit their plunger too soon. He thought about the village upstream, its narrow streets already filled with Allied vehicles waiting for the order to advance. "Close enough," he said. "Just remember, the bridge is only strong until we tell it otherwise." The boats slid into the water without a splash. Men crouched low, fingers tight around rifles and detonator cases. Overhead, the bridge loomed, a dark silhouette against a sky smeared with faint starlight, its arches like the ribs of some sleeping giant. Every creak of wood, every hiss of the river, sounded too loud. On the far bank, a German sentry stamped his feet against the cold, unaware that the shape pressing against the pier below him was not shadow, but a man. Delaney's hand closed around the rough edge of the stone. Cold seeped into his fingers as he pulled himself along the narrow ledge, the river rushing just inches below his boots. Behind him, the others followed, passing down coils of wire and bundles of explosives like a solemn, silent assembly line. He pressed the first charge against the base of the pier, feeling for the best angle, the place where stone would betray itself when the shock ran through it. He could hear the faint vibration of trucks crossing overhead, enemy vehicles moving along a route that would not exist by sunrise. "5 charges," he whispered. 2 on this pier, 2 on the next, 1 for the center. We drop the spine, the rest follows." Lewis swallowed hard. "And if we misjudge it?" "Then the bridge stays up," Delaney said calmly. "And a lot of boys have a much worse night than we're having." Above them, a German officer laughed at some joke in the guard hut, the sound drifting down through the wooden planks. It was a small thing, barely audible over the river, but it stuck with Delaney. The easy confidence, the assumption of safety. He wrapped the last line, tightened the last knot, and checked the connections one more time by touch alone. No second chances, no redos. By the time they slipped back into the boats, the charges were part of the bridge itself, tucked into the bones of it like a secret. On the Allied bank, the detonator box sat on the ground, its handle folded down. Delaney wiped his palms on his jacket and knelt beside it. In the distance, flares blossomed over the feint at the ford, casting the horizon in ghostly white. The distraction was working. The Germans were looking the wrong way. "On your word, Sergeant," the lieutenant said quietly. Delaney looked once more at the dark outline of the bridge, solid and sure against the night. For years, decades, it had carried townsfolk, farmers, soldiers, all of them trusting that stone and steel would hold. Tonight, for a few seconds, all that faith belonged to a handful of engineers on a muddy riverbank. He closed his hand around the handle. Later, he would remember the way the air seemed to pause, the way the night held its breath as he began to push. For those who remember, that was the moment when bridges stopped being permanent and became something else entirely. The river was always there, broad, slow, and deceptively peaceful. On maps it looked harmless, a thin blue curve between inked ridges and dotted hamlets. But to the men who lived and died along its banks, it was a barrier that split the world in half. Armies could retreat behind it, armies could be trapped against it, supply lines could choke on its span. The river decided who advanced and who failed. The enemy understood this. They fortified every crossing, mined every approach, sighted artillery on the slightest bend in the shoreline. And when they mocked the Allied engineers, it came from a place of genuine confidence. In their minds, no group of men with slide rules and shovels could outsmart bunkers, batteries, and concrete blasted into place by months of preparation. But the engineers, the quiet ones, the ones who spoke more with their hands than their voices, had been watching. They studied the currents, the soil, the angles of the riverbank. They noted how the wind shifted at dusk, how the fog rose in patches just before dawn. They listened to infantrymen describe what artillery sounded like from 3 miles away, and every detail, every faint clue became part of the plan forming silently in their minds. During the day, they walked the ruined villages nearby, men with calm eyes stepping over rubble to measure distances, tap beams, inspect foundations. To an outsider, they looked like surveyors, or perhaps clerks who had wandered too close to the front. But the infantry noticed their pockets full of pencils and scraps of paper covered in ratios and force calculations. A lieutenant joked once, "If the world ever ends, an engineer will be the one who knows exactly why." By late afternoon, the unit commanders gathered under a shattered barn roof while the engineers unfurled their sketches. No speeches, no bravado, just an explanation. Quiet, methodical, unshakable. The plan was not to capture a bridge. It was to erase one, and not with bombs dropped from aircraft or artillery shells lobbed blindly across the water, but with precision, with timing, with a method that required the engineers to get close. Too close, the infantry thought. Far too close. The old bridge was stone-arched, thick, built centuries before to carry carts and cattle. It had stood through every war in living memory. The enemy believed it would stand forever. They had wired it with charges of their own, intending to blow it only at the last moment. Guards paced its length, rifles in hand, boots clacking on ancient stones. Searchlights swept the water. Even the slightest ripple drew attention, and yet the engineers studied it the way a carpenter studies an old beam, seeing weakness no one else could see. "Stone ages," one of them murmured, "and with age comes fault." He placed his thumb along a hairline crack invisible to most eyes and nodded. "Here. This is where we speak to it." Night fell, and with it came the river mist, slow, rolling, drifting like a memory down the current. The infantry whispered nervously, unsure why the engineers walked so calmly toward the bank. Each man carried equipment wrapped in cloth to silence the metal. They didn't hurry. They didn't look back. Not one of them hesitated. The boats they used were nothing special. Canvas stretched over wooden frames, the kind a hunter might use on a quiet lake at dawn. But tonight, the river felt colder, heavier. Every oar stroke seemed too loud. Every splash carried weight. They moved like shadows slipping between other shadows. Behind them, the infantry watched with a mixture of awe and fear. Halfway across, a searchlight swept low across the water. The beam paused, suspended, wavering, as if the night itself held its breath. The engineers froze. No movement, no noise. The river whispered under their hulls. Then the light drifted on, uninterested. They continued. Near the pilings, they anchored the boats to broken stones slick with moss. One engineer climbed onto the support ledge beneath the bridge, his breath misting in the cold. He touched the stone gently, like someone greeting an old friend they might never see again. He placed one charge, then a second, measured distance, counted seconds silently. Another engineer whispered, "Too much weight and she falls wrong." They adjusted, recalculated. Their hands never shook. Above them, boots thudded. The guards paced back and forth, one humming a song under his breath, unaware of the men setting destruction directly beneath his feet. The engineers waited for the rhythm, one guard close, one far, then both turning at the same moment. Timing mattered more than bravery. Timing mattered more than fear. When the last charge was set, they slid back into the boats. The fog seemed to thicken as if protecting them. The engineers rowed with smooth, even strokes, not fast. Fast creates noise. Fast creates panic. They moved with the discipline of men who understood that the next 10 minutes would either define the night or end it. Once they reached shore, the infantry crowded around them. Someone asked if they succeeded. The lead engineer simply nodded, not proud, not dramatic, just factual. And then he lifted the firing box, checked the wires, and turned away from the others so they wouldn't see the strain around his eyes. They waited. The river drifted by, uncaring. A wind stirred the treetops. The world seemed to hold still for a moment too long. Then, nothing. No flash, no sound, no vibration through the earth. A young private whispered, "Did it fail?" But the engineers knew better. They listened for what wasn't there. The faintest groan of stone shifting under its own weight, the sigh of mortar cracking deep inside the arch. And then, from somewhere beneath the bridge, came that sound, a low, grinding rumble, a noise like an old giant waking from sleep. One engineer whispered, "There it is." Because this wasn't an explosion. This was controlled collapse. This was gravity obeying mathematics. This was centuries-old stone remembering its flaws. The bridge shuddered. A tremor rolled through the ground. The guards shouted, too late. The central arch sagged, and then, with a roar that echoed along the riverbanks, the entire structure gave way. Stone plunged into black water. Metal twisted. Pillars folded. The river swallowed everything. By the time the thunder faded, nothing stood where the bridge had been. Not a stone, not a rail, not a trace. And on the far bank, the enemy stared in stunned disbelief, realizing that the quiet men they mocked had reshaped the battlefield in a single night. For those who remember, this part still catches the breath. When the engineers first stepped into the French countryside after the breakout from Normandy, few noticed them. They weren't infantry. They weren't tankers. They weren't paratroopers drifting out of the sky. They were the men in rolled-up sleeves, carrying shovels, explosives, survey tools, coils of wire, and notebooks filled with angles and measurements. They moved quietly, head down, eyes scanning the ground the way other soldiers scanned tree lines. To the untrained eye, they looked like laborers following the army instead of leading it. Even some frontline commanders dismissed them. The bridge boys, they called them, or the ditch diggers. But those officers had never watched an armored column wait helplessly while a single blown bridge halted an advance worth thousands of lives. They had never heard the silence that fell when the order came. "We can't cross. We need the engineers." The German retreat in the late summer of 1944 was not chaotic. It was strategic. Every river, every canal, every culvert was prepared with charges. When the Wehrmacht withdrew, they didn't run. They erased the road behind them. Bridges fell in thunder, steel twisted like ribbon, masonry collapsed into swirling water. And so the fate of entire divisions rested on the shoulders of a few hundred men in denim fatigue jackets, moving forward with tape measures slung beside their rifles. One platoon leader, Lieutenant Arthur Brinley, remembered his first days in France as a kind of quiet nightmare. He wasn't shot at often. Engineers were rarely the first to meet the enemy. But everywhere he looked, there was destruction that needed reversing. Broken spans, cratered roads, mines buried by hands that knew exactly where to hide them. Every day felt like solving a puzzle while the clock ticked louder and louder behind him. He once wrote, "The infantry fought the Germans. We fought time." Time was the enemy the engineers understood more intimately than anyone. Time dictated whether a trapped regiment escaped encirclement. Time meant the difference between an armored push and an armored collapse. Time determined whether the enemy could reform a defensive line before the Allies punched through. And nowhere did time weigh heavier than the night the bridge over the Weir River disappeared. The Germans destroyed it at dusk, moments before an approaching American armored column reached it. A plume of dust climbed into the air, settling over the shattered timbers like a shroud. The tankers groaned, shouting curses into the wind. Officers pored over maps, arguing about detours that would cost hours, maybe days. And then someone called out the only words that mattered. "Where are the engineers?" They arrived just as the last of the smoke drifted away. They walked the edge of the river in silence, measuring the width, studying the debris, tracing the current. No one rushed. No one panicked. Engineers knew that haste killed more efficiently than artillery. They worked with the calm precision of men performing surgery on the landscape itself. The infantry watched with impatience. The tankers checked their watches. Time pressed on them all like a tightening fist. But to the engineers, the war was always like this, a quiet moment before impossible work. Brinley knelt near the water and ran his fingers through the mud. He noted the soil composition, the firmness, the slope. His sergeant, an older man named Dwyer, stood beside him with a cigar stub between his teeth. He never lit it. Regulations forbade it near explosives, but he chewed it like a ritual. "Well?" Brinley asked. Dwyer nodded. "We can do it, but it'll be all night." "All night we've got," Brinley said. The infantry didn't understand what all night meant in engineer terms. They didn't see the calculations running behind every movement: load-bearing stress, water displacement, timber strength, the angle of anchoring beams. They didn't hear the mental arithmetic conducted beneath the sounds of hammers and shouted orders. To them, it was just noise. But to an engineer, it was architecture under fire. The moon rose. Lanterns flickered along the riverbank. Men carried timbers on their shoulders like pallbearers carrying a coffin. Others drove stakes into the ground with heavy mallets, each strike echoing through the darkness. Wire cables stretched across the water like taut nerves, sweat mixed with river mist, coating their hands until every tool felt slippery. A German patrol approached at one point, but the infantry pushed them back. The engineers barely looked up. They had no time for firefights. They were fighting the river itself. Brinley's hands bled before midnight. Dwyer's voice went hoarse, shouting instructions. Men hammered until their arms trembled. And still, the bridge didn't yet exist. Only the ghost of one, rising slowly from the shadows. Hours later, the first timber groaned into place, then another. Then the crawl of progress quickened. The river that had seemed impassable began to accept the will of the engineers. The infantry, watching from a distance, shifted from impatience to awe. A private whispered, "They're building a miracle." No one corrected him, because it wasn't just a structure they were raising. It was the path forward, the promise that the push would continue, the silent guarantee that the German line would not reform. At one point, near dawn, Brindley leaned against a timber and closed his eyes for a moment. He could hear the river rushing beneath him, feel the vibrations of hammer strikes through the wooden frame, and he thought to himself, if this holds, men will live. If it fails, men will die. That was the engineer's burden, waged not with rifles but with calculations. By the time the eastern sky began to brighten, the shape of a bridge, sturdy, improbable, defiant, stood where the Germans had left ruin. Exhausted, mud-streaked men tightened the final bolts as the tankers revved their engines in anticipation. When the first Sherman rolled across, the bridge groaned, flexed, and held. The infantry erupted into cheers. The tank crews saluted the engineers as they passed. Brindley simply sat in the mud, breathing hard, staring at the bridge as though seeing it for the first time. "They don't understand," Dwyer muttered beside him. "No," Brindley replied softly, "but they don't have to." The sound of those tank engines rolling across the river stayed with him forever. It was the sound of triumph, not of battle, but of construction. Not of destruction, but of repair. And for the Germans on the other side of the river, hearing those same engines meant something else entirely. They didn't just lose ground that night, they lost belief. The column halted just short of the river bend. Engines idled low, clicking softly as they cooled. The infantry officers crouched over a map pinned beneath a flashlight, voices hushed but urgent. The German presence on the far bank had doubled since dusk. New machine gun pits, fresh wire, mortar crews adjusting angles by instinct alone. If any crossing attempt happened now, it would be torn apart before the first boat touched the current. The engineers listened from the shadows, helmets resting against their packs, the cold seeping through their knees. They had seen this before, the fear that rippled through units forced to depend on a handful of men whose names rarely made reports. A rifle platoon could win a hill, a tank unit could hold a road, but only engineers could erase what the enemy trusted most, the ground beneath their own feet. One of the younger engineers, barely 20, slid his hands into his pockets and whispered to the sergeant beside him, "They don't want us to go down there." The sergeant didn't look at him. He just kept watching the river, the moonlight cutting a pale wound across the water. After a moment, he said, "That's why we're going." A distant artillery thump rolled over the landscape. German spotlights swept lazily across the far tree line, searching for shapes that weren't there, not yet. The engineers worked in silence, unspooling rope, checking clamps, inspecting charges with the dull detachment of men who knew the difference between steady hands and trembling ones, could determine if sunrise arrived for anyone at all. The river was an old one, its current patient and deceptive. From shore, it seemed slow, but the engineers knew better. They could hear the telltale hiss beneath the surface, the pull that could overturn a raft or drag a man under before his friends even realized he had slipped. "Keep your footing," the sergeant murmured as he tested the edge with his boot. It sank half an inch into soaked sand. "It looks calm. It lies." Across the water, the Germans laughed around their fires, unaware that an American advance sat just out of sight. They had spent weeks reinforcing the bridge, tightening bolts, replacing planks, widening the center span to support armor. To them, it was invincible, a structure built on stone foundations and guarded by guns that could sweep the entire approach. The engineers saw something else. They saw weight distribution. They saw tension points. They saw where the grain of the wood had darkened from damp, where the joists dipped under their own burden, where the masonry had been patched by hands rushing against time. To a commander, it was a bridge. To an engineer, it was a blueprint waiting to be undone. Orders came down in a soft ripple. Move. Now. The men slipped down the bank like shadows tearing from the earth itself. They carried almost nothing. Charges, fuses, wire spools, small tools wrapped in cloth to keep them from clinking. Every sound mattered. A single misplaced step could betray the entire operation. But they moved with the quiet confidence of craftsmen, hands steady, breath measured. The first man touched the water and inhaled sharply at the cold. The next followed. Soon a line of engineers waded waist deep, rifles slung behind them, though they hoped never to fire a shot. The enemy must believe the night belonged to them. Halfway across, the current pressed harder, nudging legs off balance. A corporal lost his footing for a heartbeat, his pack dipping into the water. 2 hands caught him instantly. No words, just the tightening of a grip that reminded him, "We do not fall alone." When they reached the far bank, they crouched beneath the shadow of the bridge. Up close, it loomed larger than intelligence reports had suggested. Reinforced earlier than expected. More beams, more cross-bracing, a second layer of planks. The Germans had been preparing for something. "Doesn't matter," the sergeant whispered. "Everything built can be unbuilt." They moved beneath the structure like surgeons working in a dim, improvised theater. Each man had a role. One measured, one drilled, one placed charges, one wired fuses through the beams. They didn't speak, not from fear, but from discipline. Engineers knew that noise wasn't the enemy. Mistakes were. Overhead, German boots thudded across the boards, the rhythm steady and unalarmed. A sentry smoked at the midpoint, tapping ash through the slats. It rained down in soft gray flecks, drifting onto the engineer crouched below. He didn't even blink. He had a charge to place. That was all that existed. Minutes passed like hours. The fuses curled through the frame like vines, thin and harmless looking. A single tug would snap them. A single misfire would leave the entire squad exposed beneath the very structure meant to collapse. But every connection held. Every segment fit. Every line found its place. When the last charge was set, the sergeant gave a single nod. The men slid into the water again, moving upstream along the underside of the bank to avoid detection. The river welcomed them with renewed cold, swallowing their boots, their uniforms, their breath. But none of them hesitated. They were going home the way they came, unseen. When they reached the midpoint of the return, a flare shot into the sky, white, blinding, blooming like a cruel flower overhead. The river lit up like polished steel. German rifles snapped into position, voices barked, orders flew. The engineers froze, not panicked, not broken, just still, calculating. The sergeant whispered, "We're not fighting, we're finishing." He handed the fuse line to the corporal nearest him. Cold hands tightened around it as the flare burned out and darkness reclaimed the river. On the far shore, the Germans cursed the night, thinking they had scared away animals. The engineers reached the friendly bank soaked, shivering, but intact. The sergeant pulled the fuse, the spark racing downstream like a ghost carried by current. It vanished under the bridge. They didn't watch through binoculars. They didn't count down. They simply waited, listening to the water breathe. And then somewhere deep beneath the beams, a hollow crack trembled through the night, so faint it could have been mistaken for a shifting branch. Another, then another. The sound of structure remembering it was mortal. For those who remember, this part will hit home. By the spring of 1945, the riverbanks that once echoed with explosions had grown strangely quiet. The engineers who had spent the war crawling through mud, wiring charges in darkness, whispering instructions beneath artillery thunder, were now moving with slower steps. The urgency of those desperate nights, the nights when a single bridge meant the difference between breakthrough and disaster, had finally begun to fade. But the memory of the vanished bridge, that bridge, the one the enemy had sworn was indestructible, did not fade. Not for the men who wired it. Not for the enemy commander who awoke to emptiness where steel once stood. And not for the infantry who crossed the river safely because a handful of engineers refused to accept impossible. Those engineers, mud-soaked, exhausted, overlooked, became something else entirely in the final months of the war. They were the quiet planners behind every advance, the minds who turned obstacles into afterthoughts, the men who arrived first and left last, slipping through darkness long before anyone else knew which direction the war would turn. And when the German lines finally cracked, when the rivers no longer marked boundaries of terror, the engineers found themselves walking across bridges they had built, repaired, or destroyed. Some carried tools, others carried nothing at all, just the weight of memory. One American engineer, older now, visiting the Rhine decades later, paused at the water's edge. Where he once crouched under fire, the shoreline was calm. The river moved slowly, almost gently, as if the water itself had forgotten. He knelt down, touched the stones beneath his hand, and whispered a single line he'd carried for years. "We weren't heroes. We were just the men who made sure heroes could get across." That was the truth of the engineers. They didn't write history. They cleared the space for it to be written. They didn't chase glory. They protected it from collapsing under its own weight. In Italy, in France, in Belgium, in Germany, everywhere the war moved, there were roads the infantry never saw in darkness until an engineer had walked them first. There were rivers no one thought crossable until an engineer marked the depth, searched the current, set the pontoons. There were bridges no one thought breakable until an engineer loosened the final bolt, planted the final charge, whispered, "Ready," and disappeared into the smoke before anyone knew what had happened. And those same bridges are now visited by tourists who pause, take photographs, and read plaques without knowing the names of the men who made those crossings possible. That anonymity is part of the legacy. Engineers never expected to be remembered, but they deserve to be. When the war ended, many returned home to quiet lives. Some became construction foremen, surveyors, city planners. Some built roads in places where children played instead of tanks rolling through smoke. Some never touched explosives again. But every one of them carried the same silent truth. The war turned not only on firepower, not only on courage, but on engineering, on the invisible hands that shaped terrain into opportunity. Decades later, a bridge engineer in his 70s stood at a war memorial beside a young boy, his grandson. The boy pointed to a rusted steel girder recovered from a blown bridge and asked, "Did you ever blow one up like that?" The old man smiled, eyes softening with memory. "Not one like that," he said. "Ours was bigger." The boy laughed. The old man didn't. He was remembering the night the river lit sky white, and the impossible became real. Some memories never dull. For the engineers who survived, the war remained a world of angles, weights, distances, and timing. A world measured not in miles or medals, but in seconds. How many seconds before the patrol passed? How many seconds the fuse needed? How many seconds remained before daylight exposed everything? They lived in those seconds. They made those seconds matter. And when the rivers were crossed, when the enemy was pushed back, when the final bridges fell behind the retreating line, it became clear even to those who once mocked them that engineers had shaped the battlefield as surely as any general. For those watching who remember that generation, who remember the men who carried wire coils instead of rifles, who moved through darkness instead of parades, you understand this better than anyone. You know that sometimes the ones who speak the least carry the heaviest part of the war. And if your father, grandfather, or great-uncle served in an engineer battalion, Army, Royal Engineers, Seabees, sappers, you know their stories were often told quietly or not told at all. But their work stood behind every victory. Their calculations saved lives. Their hands pulled men across waters they never should have survived. The enemy stopped laughing the moment the bridge disappeared, but history began remembering the moment the war crossed the river because of them. Tonight, someone may drive across a peaceful bridge somewhere, steel warmed by sunlight, river calm beneath it, and never know that bridges once meant life or death. But you'll know. And now, so will the people who watch this story. If you haven't yet, take a second to like this video and subscribe to Ghosts of WW2, because stories like this, stories of calm men doing impossible things in the dark, are too important to lose. For those who remember, the river still flows. The bridge is gone, but the engineers never truly left.